in modern marketing with none other than American Eagle CMO Craig Brommer in conversation with David Sable. This is going to be an exciting conversation, so let's get the energy back up in the room. I know it's 2 p.m., but come on, let's do it. Thank you guys.
First of all, guys, come on. This is like American Eagle. I need some energy. Not enough. Everybody stand up. Quick, stand up. Everybody, come on, stand up, stand up. Does everybody stand up? Everybody. Now let's hear it. Neil, come on. American Eagle. There you go. Sit down. You want to start. All right. Question, Greg, before we start, here's the question. Who in this room is not aware of the Sydney Sweeney story? Put your hand up if you have the guts, if you haven't heard of it.
I don't see why.
No worries, everybody knows about Sydney Sweeney. First of all, Craig Brommers, in my opinion, is the best CMO in retail. Now, let me tell you why maybe you should take it with a grain of salt. It's because I am on the board of American Eagle, so I have to make it full transparency.
My height
and be honest with you. But the thing is, I do believe he's the best.
I appreciate it. And it's finally good to unpack one of the most fascinating and at times very unexpected journeys that any CMO this year made in this decade. So this will be a fun conversation.
So let's start. I think when you talk to people, and I imagine there are people in this room who believe it as well, there are people in the world who think that you created that campaign to create the news that it created, to create the controversy.
So listen, the brief to the team more than 9 months ago at this point was to partner with the In Girl of 2025 to create the In Jeans campaign of 2025, and I think mission accomplished on that one. I knew that when we cast Sydney Sweeney in this campaign that it would get unprecedented attention. Obviously, some of the feedback went into a direction that none of us foresaw, and I'm just going to say this on the stage, and I don't care if you record me or not. That feedback was absurd and offensive, quite honestly, and I think most Americans understood that, and obviously the results of the campaign, which David and I will get into in just a second, will back up that claim that most Americans, again, thought some of that feedback was absurd.
So okay, back up 1 second. So you launched the campaign.
So guys, we launched the campaign on July 23rd, and the first of many news cycles on this was one of crazy celebration, because just the announcement that Sydney Sweeney was in our American Eagle campaign jacked up our stock price by 25% overnight. And literally for the first 4 days, we were the toast of the town in marketing, advertising, entertainment, certainly business press.
And most of the stories, by the way, they said, finally, a return to optimism in retail. Finally, real advertising.
And I think finally, big bets. I think that if I'm being self-critical of my industry, honestly, I could be even self-critical of marketing overall. I think we've all played it a little bit safe. And so we knew that this campaign would make noise, but it was that Sunday after that launch when I first realized that this thing was going in a slightly different direction.
And then we spoke. And so again, full transparency. At that point, we brought in some resources from Stagwell, and I can tell you it's public knowledge because as a board member, I have to declare this as a related transaction, so it's all so public. I wasn't involved in it, other than obviously pieces I was. But what happened, one of the things that we talked about was, as you know, the wisdom, the traditional, if you will, wisdom, the conventional wisdom of social media is, well, you know, it's not social media if you don't answer it right away. You have to be, the few has to be on the trigger. phenomenal. Guys did.
That's right, David. And honestly, I now have names for the things because I lived through this. I think one is you cannot believe the negative hype machine. And in this case, that negative hype machine was both social media and the mainstream press. And the other thing that you can't trust is the crisis communications industrial complex, because their playbook would have stated to do something very different than what we did. And so I just want to be very crystal clear on what we did. For the first time that Sunday morning over a cup of coffee, I read some very nasty comments directed at me, the brand, and my team. Really nasty. And I was like, whoa, this is coming out of nowhere. And then I remember my high school daughter walking down for lunch and telling me, by the way, Dad, you're being canceled on TikTok right now. And I knew at that point we had something going on. By Monday, as David just mentioned, it was the one and only day of the last 10 weeks that we did have net negative social sentiment. So any narrative that this campaign was swamped by negativity is absolutely untrue. But I knew at that point we couldn't just listen to social media, and we couldn't just listen to the emerging stories on the mainstream media. We actually had to pay attention to what real Americans were saying. And guys, I'm telling you, I felt like I was living in an alternate universe, because on one hand, I'm looking at business performance, I'm looking at customer performance, I'm looking at advertising performance, and ultimately I'm looking at data from our friends at Stagwell, giving us a sense of what real Americans are thinking. And then in this other universe over here, I mean, the vitriol and the stuff is just coming in all over the place. But to David's point, that is, I think, maybe the best thing we did over the course of this campaign was do nothing. Do nothing. Because once I saw the data, I felt pretty confident that most Americans understood that this was clearly not a campaign that was rooted in Nazism, rooted in white supremacy, or rooted in eugenics. It just wasn't. Never was. And so we didn't do anything until that Friday, when we came out with our one and only statement, in this case social media posts on Instagram, that very clearly articulated the meaning of this campaign. It was always about Sydney, it was always her story, it was always about her genes. And we clearly indicated that we were going to continue to execute this campaign as originally intended. And the next day, the campaign is up on the Sphere in Las Vegas, which of course made a bit of news as well. But David, that probably wasn't the end of the story. So
Bloomberg wrote that you rewrote the book on how to deal with social media.
Yeah, and again, we went dark, we went quiet, and we said nothing, and I think that was the right thing. Because in this case, I think the reaction to the reaction was what won this, at least these first 6 weeks for us. Again, this was not the end of the story, right? That weekend, the president makes some comments on the tarmac, and then has a pretty full-throated endorsement of this campaign in a Sydney, and there was another stock jump of 25%, and that was another wrinkle in my summer of 2025. But again, we just let everyone talk and comment about whatever they wanted to. And I think it's so interesting because I think this piece of creative did what the best creative does, is people project whatever they're thinking onto something. And my trip around the modern media landscape was so interesting because we touched every part of it, right guys? From business to entertainment to retail to social to culture wars to politics. We had everything in this. And it was just a fascinating journey to take.
One of the things that we talked about was the reverse megaphone that very often happens, right? So most of us would never have seen the negative comments because we're not in that particular environment of that age group, of that cohort. But what happened was that the New York Times and everybody else picks up the story. So there's this reverse measurement. And all of a sudden, people like us, thinking I was getting the calls of doing it, they said, oh my God, what are you doing? What's happening?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is on two fronts, the social media and then the mainstream press. I think from a social media perspective, it was really my first experience on how algorithms really owned your brain. Like, I mean, my algorithm was very different from other people's algorithms that were shared with me. And again, back to these alternate universes you're living in, is you had, in my algorithm, people saying, you know, it's absurd, I can't believe this, all the things, and then other algorithms were saying different things, including very personal and very aggressive harassment of myself and very junior members of the team. That could be another penalty. But then the other thing is that the mainstream press picked up on it, and I am very pragmatic and understand that this is a very spicy story. It had all the elements to it. And I knew that the first round or two of the news cycle was going to lean into some of those spicier elements, but by the time we had essentially told the world that we were going to continue to move forward with the campaign, I was surprised about the lack of coverage around what if this is working? Like, what if this is actually doing what American Eagle hoped it would always do, which was command all the conversation in the most important time frame of the year for my company, acquire new customers at an unprecedented rate, deliver double-digit traffic to our brand, again, during what is the Super Bowl of denim for all year long. And it was doing all those things, but no one was really covering that in the mainstream press. And again, it's clickbaity and all this stuff, so I'm super pragmatic and unemotional about it. But it really was not until our earnings call, which was on September 3rd, 6 weeks later, that there was a little bit of positivity out there that, okay, maybe this actually did.
You also did a great presentation.
I appreciate that. And again, to David's point, when we were able to clarify kind of the results of the campaign, on that earnings call, I had the privilege of joining. And by the way, guys, this is very rare for any CMO to join a publicly traded company's earnings call. It's usually the CEO, the CFO, and call it a day. But the demand and interest about this campaign was so high that they kindly asked me to join. And that was the largest stock increase in the history of the company. It went up 38% that day when we were able to finally unpack some of the results. But again, David, it wasn't really until that moment that I felt like there were some beginnings to understand what the other side of that conversation was and why it is so important, in my humble opinion, so important for brands to take big swings, because we really are in the attention economy today. And I have two at home, I love them dearly, but Gen Zers have a very short attention span, and I think that this campaign, followed by something that David and I will talk about in just a second, have the ability to stop and the world basically, have everyone pay attention and everyone have a conversation about whatever they wanted to have a conversation about.
So let's follow that down. One of the things, because we're talking about news, we're talking about future of news here. In the previous panel, I talked about some research that we issued this today. 66% of Americans get their news from social media. Interestingly enough, I just want to make sure I get this right, Gen Z, 86%, Millennials, 84%, Gen X, 66%, Boomers, 36%, and yet, listen to the data, the least trusted people to get news from, or sources of news, are social media influencers, social media stories, and politicians. Sort of makes sense, right? And the most biased sources, which again makes sense because they're the least trusted, are, in this same order, influencers, stories, and politicians. What do you make of it?
I make of it that this is going to be a really confusing time for all of us process to enter because I was constantly getting TikTok sent to me. Hey Craig, is this real? What about this? What about this? And a lot of it was fake. The New York Times actually did a very interesting study on this particular campaign, and initially we were attacked by bots. There were a lot of bots that went after us. So I just think it's a very confusing time where all of us need to very much process what we're consuming before we overreact to things that may or may not be true, which I guess probably backs into, again, our strategy during this was just to understand what we were really working through before we came out and did anything.
So let's just follow the notion. You spoke a little bit about data. Let's look at AI and data. How do you look to the future? How do you look to your present right now and to the future, and continue to drive? We are not an authentic brand. We're very proud of being real, which I think is an area and as American Eagle is two very, very different things. So how do you use data? How do you use AI to stay real to our audiences?
Well, I think there's so many positive things that are going on about AI. Remember, my customer base, which is mostly Gen Zers, have only grown up with algorithms, right? Whether it's Netflix, whether it's Spotify, whether it's TikTok. And so if we can give these people the right message at the right time to get the right reaction and make it positive on both sides of that equation, that to me is a win-win. I just think where it gets funky is this trust component, because again, there were negative and very fake Sydney Sweeney has great genes TikToks and other things going on out there. So the parsing of what's real and what's not it's scary, it's overwhelming, and yet here we are, and we're going to have to navigate through this together.
As you look to the future, so interestingly enough, we said YouTube is the most watched for news, followed by Instagram, followed by Facebook, followed by Instagram. TikTok is way down. And yet TikTok is your place.
It is. Again, I have to be unemotional about where our customers are going to get their information, their inspiration. And clearly TikTok is driving much of that. And I remember during that first 10 to 14 chaotic days, that while the mainstream press was loud, we didn't really listen that much to what was going on, because with my customer base, it was really what was going on TikTok and other social media platforms actually was more important. It just was. And that doesn't mean that I'm discounting what was going on in the mainstream press, and I'm not discounting that created a lot of noise for a lot of weeks, but we live and die at this point on what's going on in social media. And so it was super important for us to make sure that we were aware of what was going on, but also, again, using real-time data, accurate data to react in a responsible way.
We're here, as we keep saying, because we want you to advertise in news. What can you tell the publishers who are here? What should they be thinking about in order to convince you to advertise on their platforms?
Again, I just can't be more direct than I have to be unemotional. And if the publishers in this room are attracting a Gen Z and a Gen Alpha audience, we will follow there. But right now, from what I see, I feel like, again, to your point, David, is that my audience is going to other places to get their news, to be informed about today's issues. And there are some very clever and very young and very charismatic newscasters that are making a living, making a name for themselves on some of these social media platforms. And today, that's probably where we would go. But I do think there is going to be a thirst for real, right? And I do think that the publishers and broadcasters in this room have an opportunity to make sure that you are the most trusted and most resourced place on the planet to get real news that's really accurate. Because Gen Z also knows, like to your point, that a lot of what they're hearing on the TikToks of the world is just blatantly untrue.
One final question for everybody out there. How many people are wearing anything that is American Eagle other than the two of us? Anyone? Raise your hands. Hi,
We got an intern at the front here.
Everyone else back there, we got another one. Come see me afterwards. I have a discount cost for the rest of you. Too bad, no, it's too late. It's too late. It's too late. Final word. Final word.
Well, I think the final word is this. In the attention economy, where if you get maybe 20% of Americans to know about your campaign and recognize your campaign, you are winning. And this thing at the height of it was known by 80% of Americans. We were the national conversation. And I think for the marketers in the room, I think that taking big bets that zig when the market is zagging is something that we're going to have to do to cut through and win.
There you have it. Ladies and gentlemen,